Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome back again. I wanted to just take a little bit of time to go through topic 8.3, which is solid domestic waste. It's a very small topic, really, although I don't think I can do it justice in one video. So I just want to concentrate on the overall subject of disposal of solid domestic waste. And then in future videos, we'll come back and look at some case studies. So the main keywords I want to go through today would be solid domestic waste in terms of sustainability. And then we'll look at methods of getting rid of solid waste, which are landfill, incineration, composting, and recycling. And then the last thing I want to do is kind of evaluate those methods of disposal in terms of an overall management strategy for waste. Just before I go to the syllabus, it's just worth noting at this point, we're only looking at solid domestic waste. So therefore, it's only waste that's produced in your home. We're not looking at industrial waste. And it's only solid waste. So therefore, we're not looking at water disposal or any wastes that dissolve in water and therefore go down the drain. It's only solid waste that's taken from your house. And finally, it's worth saying that this is a kind of strange little topic that the IB have just kind of shoehorned into topic 8. So it sits along with all that stuff we've done about human populations. The justification is that all of this is part of sustainability, and we can't look at sustainability without looking at the production of waste. Remember that when you look at ecological footprint, a big part of ecological footprint that people seem to forget is that your ecological footprint includes the land needed to absorb the waste that you produce. So therefore, it's a big part of sustainability, but it sits a bit uneasily with the other stuff we've been talking about recently. Okay, so as usual, let me go to the syllabus. So this is the whole of the syllabus for topic 8.3. Pause it if you like, but I'll zoom through this fairly quickly. In terms of knowledge and understanding, we need to say that there are different types of solid domestic waste, and it's dynamic. As we said before, dynamism means it changes over location and over time. Secondly, the abundance and prevalence of non-biodegradable pollution, in particular, is a major environmental issue. I think we'll look at that a little bit separately when we look at case studies. But certainly we'll look specifically at plastic pollution and the disposal of batteries and e-waste, electronic waste. Batteries especially becoming more and more prevalent as the wastes that we produce. Number 3, waste disposal options include landfill, incineration, recycling and composting. We'll look at those individually. And then here it says there are a variety of strategies that can be used to manage solid domestic waste, and those are influenced by cultural, economic, technological and political barriers. Again, I think that's something that I won't really dwell on in this video. We'll come back to that when we look at case studies. Right, in terms of applications, I do want to look at all of these 3 things. Number 1, we'll evaluate the disposal options. Number 2, we'll compare and contrast management strategies. And number 3, we'll evaluate pollution management strategies in terms of recycling, incineration, composting, and landfill. Okay, so just be aware that I won't cover everything here. We'll come back to some of it when we look at specific case studies a little bit later on. Okay, so as a starting point, could you please just have a look at these pie charts on the right, first of all? I know there's a lot of information on this slide. Have a look at how the average LEDC compares to the average MEDC in terms of the proportions of waste that it disposes of. In MEDCs, approximately 1/3 of what we dispose of is organic, or it's biodegradable. In MEDCs, a huge part of it is packaging material made up of paper, card, and obviously documents and things like that. When you compare that to LEDCs, probably twice as much as a proportion is organic waste, much less paper, and much less in terms of proportion of other materials like metals and plastics. By the way, this graphic doesn't show you, it's just the average proportions of an MEDC versus an LEDC. It doesn't show you per person, or it doesn't make use of, or it doesn't show you how much population is in each of those average countries either. This graphic, I wasn't sure whether to include it. It's quite old. I got it from the old ESS textbook, the old Pearson textbook. It shows the relative proportions of waste produced in the UK. Pretty much says the same thing. But you can see again, approximately 1/3, or maybe a bit more than 1/3, of the waste that's produced is garden waste and kitchen waste, which is organic and which is biodegradable. Okay, I'll move on fairly quickly. Again, a lot of information in this graph. This information is from the World Bank, and it shows two things. The kind of blue and yellow that the countries are shaded show you the waste generated per capita in 2016. It's a few years old now. So let's just look at that first. Obviously, most waste per person is produced in MEDCs. And basically, as we move through the demographic transition model towards stage 4, in general, the more waste those countries produce. So you can see the most waste per person is produced in North America, Europe, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and I don't know why, this is Mongolia. Mongolia has a very big amount of waste produced per person. Generally, these colours coincide with a similar map that I showed you in terms of ecological footprint. Countries with a high ecological footprint, as we've already mentioned, will generally have a large amount of waste produced per capita. And then these bar charts, these are projections to show how much waste will increase per capita going into the future. This is 2016, this is 2030, and this is 2050. So you can see that in all parts of the world, as we go through time and you get towards the age that I am at the moment, all parts of the world will continue to increase in terms of the amount of waste produced per capita. It's going to increase really rapidly in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, the Indian subcontinent. Those are countries that are pushing up through the demographic transition model towards stage 4. So as you move towards stage 4, you generally, and people get a better standard of living, you expect the amount of waste the amount of solid domestic waste that they produce per person to increase. Okay, let's move on again. So in this section, I want to move through it very quickly. I want to do an evaluation, or a very brief evaluation really, for each of the 4 disposal strategies that we mentioned in the syllabus. Okay, number 1, landfill. Landfill is simply disposing of solid waste directly to landmass, which when it's full, you cover it over. Very simple, very straightforward. The obvious advantages, well, obvious or some less obvious. The obvious advantage is it's cheap and very simple to dispose of waste in that way. It involves very little labour, certainly in MEDCs. It's all a lot of machinery, a lot of big heavy machinery that can be operated by a few people. And then one advantage that's probably less obvious is as organic waste biodegrades, it produces methane, which can be produced as a fuel. Disadvantages, that methane that's produced while being a possible fuel is also explosive, and it's also a greenhouse gas. As it rains on landfill sites, water leaches down through the waste and carries with it anything that will dissolve in the water and it carries down to the groundwater. So therefore, you're at risk of severe contamination of groundwater. It can move through to surface water as well, even water supplies for people. Okay, and then another obvious disadvantage, causes a lot of problems of noise with heavy machinery, smell problems, and vermin, including insects, rats, and birds. Okay, moving quickly on, incineration. If landfill doesn't work, then you might think a better option is to burn the waste. You're left with very little solid waste left in the form of ash, which can then be buried, or the ash can even be useful in some cases. So advantages: one, the volume of waste that has to be sent to landfill is reduced considerably. Number two, you can produce energy by burning the waste, and you can produce heat. The heat can be used for heating or even to produce energy in the form of electricity if you use that heat energy to boil water and then use the water vapor to power turbines. Number three, the ash doesn't have to go to landfill. It can be used for building materials like infill for road building, or even it can be squashed to produce bricks in some cases. Disadvantages: many waste gases are produced, obviously including carbon dioxide, but also depending on what materials you're burning, you can produce sulfur oxides, nitrous oxides, and chlorine gas, which are toxic in themselves, but you know that sulfur oxide and nitrous oxides can form acid rain. If you burn plastic, you produce dioxins. And dioxins are just about the most toxic substance per gram that is known to humankind. This is Viktor Yushchenko, who was the president of Ukraine, and it appears that he was purposely poisoned by dioxins. He blamed the Russians, or the KGB, and this is what affected a tiny amount on his appearance before and after his poisoning. He did survive, but with a lot of scarring all over his body. Other disadvantages, well, we've already said this, nitrous oxides and sulfur oxides can lead to acid rain. All these gases in general lead to smog. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and just burning these things in general and the smog that they produce lead to lung diseases, and it can be very irritating for people with problems like asthma. Well, more than irritating, disabling. Okay, another disadvantage is if you're carting all of these wastes around to incinerators, it can produce a lot of road traffic, a lot of transportation costs, noise pollution, use of fuels, and also the production of more greenhouse gases. Next. Okay, composting. Composting is more specific than the first two because it only applies to biodegradable organic wastes. So there's obvious advantages. Obviously, it means you're reusing organic material and you can use it to produce compost or soil that can be used to grow plants. An obvious advantage, as we said, about 30% in MEDCs of solid domestic waste is organic, so therefore you're diverting that from landfill, which it might go to otherwise. Introduces beneficial microorganisms to soil. You can use it as a mulch or to provide more nutrients to soil, a fertilizer. Another thing that's pretty obvious is you can do it yourself. You can do it on a domestic scale, or you can send your waste to municipal centres where they can do it on a huge scale. There's a lot to be said for composting in your own home. I've been doing this for about 10 years now, and I've found that the amount of waste that I produce, if you combine that with reducing the amount of plastic that you waste, especially the amount of paper and cardboard, you can get the amount of domestic waste you're actually sending to landfill almost down to zero, or very close to zero. Okay, if you're not sending your organic waste to landfill, you're reducing problems of leaching and eutrophication in landfill sites. Disadvantages, pretty much the same as what I said before for incineration. It can involve the transportation of very heavy and dense wastes if you're sending it to municipal composting sites. You have to carefully control what goes into your compost. If you put anything toxic into compost, you can destroy a huge batch of compost, because then it becomes unusable on land. And it can be costly, time consuming and labour intensive to produce a big batch of compost, especially in terms of time. It takes a long time to compost large amounts of waste. Okay, so that's an evaluation of methods of disposal. Let's look specifically at a very simple strategy for solid domestic waste disposal. The big blue arrow on the left hand side is because obviously these things have a pecking order, things that you should do before you do the other things. So obviously the main management strategy we should try to do is to reduce the amount of waste we produce in the first place. That might be in terms of the consumer, or it might be in terms of the industry that's producing those wastes in the first place, like packaging. After reducing the waste, we come to reuse. It's important to try and reuse as much as possible. So that could be something as simple as getting your water, if you need to get your water supplied, in a reusable garrafon. It could be simple as, rather than throwing away a product that's broken, try to mend it. I know in the UK, for example, in recent years there's been this kind of this birth of a movement where people provide the services for free to try to repair things, to encourage people to repair rather than throw away. And it could be something as simple as donating your used things to people that might be able to use it, rather than throwing it directly in the bin. After reduction, we should try to recover as much as possible. Recovery, I've included recycling, composting and incineration. Obviously incineration is less desirable than the first two. And if we can't do any of those things, then we dispose. And disposal involves throwing your waste to landfill. You're probably used to the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. I've made it slightly more complicated now. I've included recycling in recovery. So reduce, reuse, recover. And if we can't do any of those three things, then we dispose. The aim here is to reduce disposal as much as possible by looking at the other 3 options first. Okay, then now we've looked at recycling, we'll look at the evaluation of recycling. Again, pretty obvious. The advantages of recycling is it reduces pressure on landfill and reduces the natural capital that we take from the environment in the first place to produce these products. Disadvantages, again, we've mentioned this before. It could involve a lot of transportation to specific recycling sites, and that in itself can be the cause of the production of a lot of greenhouse gases. And again, it might be costly, time consuming and labour intensive. And recycling, when we produce recycled products, it could involve toxic byproducts that again have to be disposed of to the environment. Okay, that's pretty much it, but I want to leave you with this graphic. I hope it's almost visible. It's in the syllabus, and I will give you a copy of this separately anyway. This is what the IB, a kind of second methodology of a management strategy. and we'll go through this separate in a separate video, but I just wanted to leave it with you. Rather than the simple one that I put on the screen before, the IB likes you to think of, in terms of pollution management, of first of all tackling human activity. After that, tackling the release to the environment, or the release of the pollutant to the environment. And thirdly, looking at stopping the impact of the pollutants on ecosystems. Now, I don't want to do this as part of solid domestic waste, because we'll look at this specifically when we look at pollution as a topic, which comes later. But it's probably worth just pausing the video at this point and just having a look at that and comparing it back to the simple management strategy that I showed you before. The 3 R's and the 1 D. Okay, again, I've rabbited on far too long. Have a look at this in your own time, please. Make your own notes and get back to me with any questions. And then we'll start looking at specific case studies for specific types of solid domestic waste. Okay, so as usual, take care, and I'll speak to you at our lesson at some point this week. Okay, goodbye everybody.